Michael Ross pressed his back against the rough pine bark, his wrists raw and bleeding from the coarse rope that bound him 15 feet above the forest floor. The wildlife traffickers had left him here to die, their cruel laughter still echoing through the towering trees of Yellowstone's back country. A low growl rumbled through the gathering dusk. What emerged from the shadows wasn't the black bear or mountain lion he'd expected. It was a massive gray wolf with piercing blue eyes, scarred muzzle, and shoulders that spoke of hard survival. Park Ranger Sarah Chen would later describe the security footage as impossible. Dr. Martinez dropped her clipboard when she heard the initial report. The seasoned wildlife biologist had never documented anything like this in 30 years of field research. Michael had photographed wolves before, had studied their pack behavior, their territorial instincts. This wolf should have seen him as either prey or threat. Instead, the animal approached the tree trunk with deliberate purpose, opened its powerful jaws, and began methodically chewing through the rope that held a dying man captive. What drove this apex predator to save a human stranger? And why would this single act of wilderness mercy change everything we thought we knew about the bond between man and beast? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that life-changing encounter in the Yellowstone wilderness, Michael Ross had been a different man entirely. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet precision of someone who had once saved lives under impossible circumstances. As an Army medic in Afghanistan, he had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles and performed field surgery with mortars falling around him. But that steady-handed confidence had shattered 3 years ago on a rain-soaked highway outside Denver. Sarah and 6-year-old Emma had been driving home from Emma's dance recital when a drunk driver ran a red light. Michael had been working late, editing photographs for National Geographic when the call came. By the time he reached the hospital, his world had already ended. Sarah died on impact. Emma held on for 2 days, her small hand gripping his as machines kept her breathing. The last words she spoke were asking why Daddy wasn't there to see her perform her solo. The guilt consumed him like a slow-burning fire. If he hadn't taken that assignment, if he had gone to the recital, if he had been driving instead of Sarah, the what-ifs became a constant companion. Friends and family urged him to return to medical practice, but Michael couldn't bear to touch another person's life when he had failed to protect the two that mattered most. Instead, he retreated behind a camera lens, finding the only peace he could in documenting wildlife that existed without human complications. His reputation as a nature photographer grew quietly but steadily. Editors praised his ability to capture intimate moments in the wild, the tender interaction between a mother elk and her calf, the patient teaching of a hawk training its young to hunt. What they didn't realize was that Michael was drawn to these scenes of family bonds he could never have again. Each photograph was both tribute and self-inflicted wound. The Yellowstone assignment had come through his editor at National Geographic. Wolf populations were recovering throughout the northern Rockies, and the magazine wanted a comprehensive photo essay documenting pack behavior during the autumn months. Michael had accepted immediately, knowing that wolves, with their complex social structures and fierce loyalty to family, would either heal something broken inside him or finish breaking it entirely. He had been tracking a particular pack for 3 weeks when he first noticed the lone wolf. Unlike the cohesive group dynamics he had been documenting, this animal traveled alone through the vast wilderness. Through his telephoto lens, Michael caught glimpses of unusual characteristics, piercing blue eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence, and a distinctive scar running from the wolf's left ear down to his jaw. The animal moved with the confidence of an alpha, but without the pack that should have followed. Local rangers told Michael that lone wolves rarely survived long in Yellowstone's harsh ecosystem. They needed pack support to take down large prey and defend territory from other predators. Yet this solitary wolf had not only survived, but seemed to thrive, claiming a range that stretched across 300 square miles of some of the most unforgiving wilderness in North America. What Michael didn't know, as he prepared to spend another day tracking this mysterious animal, was that their lives were about to intersect in a way that would challenge everything both species thought they knew about trust, survival, and the possibility of finding family in the most unexpected places. The morning of September 15th started like any other in Michael's 3-week vigil. He rose before dawn in his small camp nestled among the lodgepole pines, brewing coffee over a portable burner while checking weather conditions on his satellite phone. The forecast promised clear skies and cool temperatures, perfect conditions for wildlife photography. His telephoto lens had captured remarkable shots of the lone wolf over the past few days, but Michael sensed there was more to document about this unusual animal's behavior. Following fresh tracks along Specimen Creek, Michael moved silently through the forest with the practiced stealth he'd learned during his military service. The wolf's paw prints were distinctive, larger than average, with a slight drag mark from what appeared to be an old injury to the left rear pad. These tracks had become as familiar to Michael as a signature, leading him deeper into Yellowstone's backcountry than any tourist had ventured in decades. It was the sound of human voices that first alerted him something was wrong. Harsh, clipped syllables in accented English carried through the morning air from a clearing ahead. Michael crept closer, camera ready, expecting to encounter illegal campers or perhaps poachers. What he discovered was far worse. Through his viewfinder, Michael watched in horror as 3 men in military-style clothing worked systematically around a large cage truck. The vehicle's cargo bed contained multiple steel crates, each sized perfectly for capturing medium to large wildlife. But it was the smaller cages that made Michael's blood run cold. Wire enclosures just big enough for wolf pups, with blankets stained with what could only be blood. The leader, a tall man with Slavic features and cold gray eyes, directed the operation with professional efficiency. His companions, one heavy-set with crude tattoos covering his forearms, the other, thin and nervous, moved with the practiced coordination of men who had done this many times before. They were setting up what appeared to be a sophisticated trapping operation, complete with electronic sensors and remotely triggered cage doors. Michael's hands trembled as he adjusted his camera settings, understanding that he was witnessing something that could devastate Yellowstone's recovering wolf population. The illegal wildlife trade was worth billions globally, and wolf pups commanded premium prices from private collectors and exotic pet enthusiasts who cared nothing for conservation laws or animal welfare. Through his telephoto lens, Michael documented everything: license plates, faces, equipment serial numbers. His camera's memory card filled with evidence that could shut down this operation and potentially save dozens of wolves. But his concentration on gathering evidence proved to be a fatal mistake. The camera's autofocus motor, normally silent, emitted the faintest mechanical whir as it adjusted to capture a distant shot. In the profound quiet of the wilderness morning, that tiny sound carried further than Michael had anticipated. The thin man's head snapped up like a startled deer. "Did you hear that?" Michael froze, finger still on the shutter button, hoping against hope that the sound had been dismissed as a bird or small animal, but the leader's eyes were already scanning the tree line with the methodical precision of a trained hunter. "There." The gray-eyed man pointed directly at Michael's hiding spot. "Behind the deadfall, 50 meters northeast." Michael's military training kicked in immediately. He pocketed the memory card, shouldered his camera bag, and began moving through the forest as silently as possible. But 3 men who knew these woods intimately and weren't burdened with photography equipment had significant advantages. The chase lasted 20 terrifying minutes. Michael used every evasion technique he remembered from Afghanistan, but the traffickers moved with the coordination of a professional unit. They herded him away from established trails, deeper into wilderness, where his disappearance might go unnoticed for weeks. When Michael finally stumbled into a clearing, exhausted and disoriented, the three men were waiting for him. The leader held a military-grade tranquilizer gun while his companions flanked Michael from both sides. "Well, well," the gray-eyed man said in heavily accented English. "American photographer thinks he can play hero, yes?" He gestured for Michael to remove his camera bag and satellite phone. "Viktor Kozlov does not appreciate tourists who stick their noses where they do not belong." The heavy-set man rifled through Michael's equipment, smashing his expensive camera against a tree trunk and grinding the fragments under his boot heel. But when he found the memory card in Michael's pocket, Victor's cold expression turned genuinely dangerous. "You have seen too much, photographer. Now we have problem." Victor studied Michael with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. "We could kill you quickly, but that creates evidence. Bodies raise questions. Better you simply disappear into wilderness, yes? Let nature take its course." The nervous man produced a coil of thick rope, while the heavy-set accomplice selected a remote pine tree, far from any established trail. They bound Michael's wrists with professional efficiency, securing him to the trunk 15 feet above ground level where his scent would carry on the wind, but where no casual hiker would ever think to look. "Yellowstone is big place," Victor said conversationally as his men finished their work. "Many dangers for careless tourists. Bears, mountain lions, hypothermia. Sometimes people just disappear, and nobody ever knows why." The three men packed their equipment and disappeared into the forest, leaving Michael alone with the growing realization that he was going to die in this remote clearing, just as Sarah and Emma had died, without him there to help, without anyone knowing what had happened until it was too late. 8 hours passed like an eternity. Michael's wrists had long since gone numb from the coarse rope cutting into his flesh, and the September afternoon sun had given way to the bone-chilling cold that descended on Yellowstone's high country after dark. His military training had taught him to assess survival situations methodically, but every calculation led to the same grim conclusion. He was going to die in this remote clearing, just as Viktor Kozlov had intended. The irony wasn't lost on him. After surviving roadside bombs in Afghanistan and pulling wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, he would meet his end tied to a tree like some medieval prisoner. Worse still, his death would accomplish nothing. Without his photographic evidence, Kozlov's trafficking operation would continue decimating wolf populations across the northern Rockies. More families would be torn apart, more pups stolen from their dens to satisfy the twisted desires of wealthy collectors who treated wild animals like exotic trophies. As darkness deepened around him, Michael's thoughts turned inevitably to Sarah and Emma. He had failed them by choosing work over Emma's recital, and now he was failing them again by dying uselessly in the wilderness. They deserved a husband and father who would fight to stay alive, who would find a way to honor their memory through meaningful action. Instead, he had stumbled into a situation that would make him just another missing person statistic. The temperature continued dropping. Michael's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and he could feel hypothermia beginning its insidious work on his body. His fingers tingled with dangerous numbness, and a treacherous drowsiness crept through his consciousness. He forced himself to stay alert by reciting Emma's favorite bedtime story, the one about the brave princess who saved her kingdom through kindness rather than force. That's when he heard the first soft footfall in the underbrush. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs as something large moved through the forest beyond his vision. Yellowstone was home to grizzly bears, black bears, and mountain lions, all perfectly capable of killing a helpless human. His scent had been carried on the wind for hours now, advertising his vulnerability to every predator in the area. After everything he had endured, he was about to become prey. The footsteps circled the clearing with deliberate patience. Whatever was out there was taking its time, assessing the situation before committing to action. Michael strained his eyes against the darkness, catching glimpses of movement between the pine trunks, but unable to identify the source. His breathing became shallow and rapid as primal fear overrode rational thought. Then, stepping into a shaft of moonlight with liquid grace, appeared the lone wolf he had been tracking for 3 weeks. Those distinctive blue eyes reflected the pale light like sapphires, and the scar running from ear to jaw was clearly visible in the wolf's grizzled face. The animal was massive, easily 120 pounds of muscle and bone, with shoulders that spoke of countless battles for survival in this unforgiving wilderness. Every instinct Michael possessed screamed that he was about to die. But instead of the aggressive posture he expected, the wolf approached with cautious curiosity. Its ears were forward rather than pinned back, and its tail held level rather than raised in dominance or tucked in submission. The animal moved with the confident stride of an apex predator, but its body language suggested assessment rather than attack. Michael forced himself to remain absolutely still as the wolf completed its circle around the tree. He had photographed enough predators to know that sudden movement or eye contact could trigger an attack. His only chance, slim though it was, lay in convincing this animal that he posed no threat. The wolf paused directly in front of him, close enough that Michael could see the intelligence burning in those unusual blue eyes. For several heartbeats, man and wolf studied each other in profound silence. What Michael saw in that gaze defied everything he thought he knew about wild animals. There was calculation there, yes, but also something deeper, a kind of recognition that transcended species barriers. Slowly, deliberately, the wolf approached the base of the pine tree. Michael held his breath as the animal reared up on its hind legs, placing massive paws against the trunk just below where the rope secured him. The wolf's black nose twitched as it scented the coarse fibers, and Michael could hear the soft wheeze of its breathing in the frigid air. What happened next would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. The wolf opened its powerful jaws, weapons capable of crushing bone, and began carefully chewing through the rope that bound him. The process was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The wolf's teeth, designed to tear flesh and crack marrow, worked with surprising delicacy to sever the fibers without causing additional injury to Michael's already damaged wrists. Strand by strand, the rope began to weaken under the patient assault. Michael's mind reeled as he tried to process what was happening. Wolves were not rescuers of humans. They were apex predators driven by hunger, territorial instincts, and pack loyalty. Yet this solitary wolf was deliberately freeing a helpless stranger, investing time and energy in an action that provided no obvious benefit to its own survival. As the final strands parted and Michael collapsed to the forest floor, his legs too numb to support his weight, the wolf stepped back and watched calmly. There was no aggression in its posture, no sign that it viewed Michael as prey. Instead, those intelligent blue eyes seemed to hold a question. What would this human do now that he was free? Michael rubbed feeling back into his hands, never taking his eyes off the wolf. "Thank you," he whispered into the cold night air, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to speak them anyway. The wolf tilted its head slightly, as if considering this strange sound. Then, with a soft chuff that might have been acknowledgement, it turned toward the forest edge and took several deliberate steps before looking back over its shoulder. The message was unmistakably clear: "Follow me." The wolf moved through the moonlit forest with purposeful strides, pausing every 50 yards to ensure Michael was still following. Despite the numbness in his legs and the disorientation that came with hypothermia, Michael forced himself to keep pace. His military training had taught him to recognize when his body was shutting down, and he knew that movement was his only chance of generating enough heat to survive the night. The journey took nearly 3 hours across terrain that seemed impossibly difficult in the darkness. The wolf led him along game trails that would have been invisible to human eyes, around deadfall that could have broken an ankle, and across creek beds where the ice was thick enough to support their weight. Several times, when Michael stumbled or fell behind, the wolf would stop and wait patiently, those blue eyes reflecting concern that seemed almost human in its intensity. As dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the wolf guided Michael to the edge of a maintained trail. In the distance, perhaps half a mile away, the distinctive green roof of a ranger station was visible through the trees. The wolf stopped at the trail junction and looked back at Michael one final time, as if ensuring that his human companion understood where safety lay. Then, without ceremony, the wolf melted back into the forest and vanished. Michael stumbled into the Specimen Creek Ranger Station as the morning shift arrived. Ranger Jennifer Martinez found him collapsed on the front steps, suffering from mild hypothermia, dehydration, and rope burns around his wrists. After emergency treatment and several cups of hot coffee, Michael managed to tell his story to a room full of skeptical faces. "You're telling me a wolf untied you?" Ranger Captain Tom Bradley crossed his arms and studied Michael with the expression of someone who had heard tall tales from traumatized hikers before. "And then led you to safety?" "I know how it sounds," Michael said, wrapping his hands around another mug of coffee. "But that's exactly what happened. This wolf had blue eyes, really unusual blue eyes, and a scar running down the left side of its face. I've been photographing it for weeks." Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the park's lead wildlife biologist, leaned forward with interest. "Blue eyes in wolves are extremely rare. It's usually the result of a genetic mutation, and it almost never occurs in wild populations. If what you're describing is accurate, this would be a significant documentation. More significant than the wildlife trafficking ring?" Michael pulled the memory card from his pocket, the one Viktor Kozlov's men had missed in their search. "This contains photographs of their entire operation, license plates, faces, equipment, serial numbers. These men are stealing wolf pups and selling them to private collectors." The room's atmosphere changed instantly. Captain Bradley took the memory card and inserted it into a digital camera, scrolling through Michael's photographs with growing concern. The images were damning, clear documentation of an illegal operation that could devastate Yellowstone's recovering wolf population. "We need to get this to the FBI immediately," Bradley said. "Their wildlife crime unit has been tracking rumors of organized trafficking in the region for months. This could be the break they've been waiting for." Within hours, the ranger station became the center of a federal investigation. FBI agents interviewed Michael extensively, using his photographs and testimony to build a case against Viktor Kozlov's organization. But when investigators reached the clearing where Michael had been held captive, they found no trace of the trafficking operation. The criminals had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. "They're professionals," Special Agent Sarah Chen explained to the assembled team. "Mobile operations like this can disappear within hours, leaving minimal forensic evidence. But we have their faces now, and their vehicle information. We'll find them." Dr. Martinez was more interested in Michael's account of the wolf rescue. "I've studied wolf behavior for 15 years, she told him during a private conversation. "What you're describing goes against everything we know about predator-prey relationships. Wolves don't rescue humans. They avoid us whenever possible." "I know what I experienced," Michael replied. "That wolf made a conscious decision to help me. I saw intelligence in its eyes, not just animal cunning, but something deeper. Over the following weeks, as the FBI investigation continued, Michael found himself returning repeatedly to the area where his life had been saved. He told himself he was helping law enforcement locate Viktor Kozlov's operation, but truthfully, he was hoping for another encounter with the blue-eyed wolf. His persistence paid off on a crisp October morning when he spotted movement in a distant meadow. Through his telephoto lens, Michael watched as the wolf emerged from the tree line, followed by two younger animals. Not pups, but adolescent wolves who seemed to defer to the scarred male's leadership. This wasn't a traditional pack structure, but rather a collection of survivors who had found each other in the vast wilderness. The wolf seemed to sense Michael's presence. It raised its head and looked directly toward the photographer's hidden position, those distinctive blue eyes meeting the camera lens across several hundred yards. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, in a gesture that defied scientific explanation, the wolf lowered its head in what could only be described as acknowledgement before leading its small group deeper into the forest. Dr. Martinez was fascinated by Michael's continued documentation of the unusual wolf. "The behavior you're recording doesn't fit any established patterns," she said, examining his latest photographs. "This animal is exhibiting what we might call prosocial behavior, actions that benefit others without providing obvious evolutionary advantages." "Maybe we don't understand wolves as well as we think we do," Michael suggested. "Or maybe this particular wolf is exceptional," Martinez replied. "Genetic mutations that affect physical appearance sometimes correlate with neurological differences. Those blue eyes might be accompanied by enhanced cognitive abilities." The conversation was interrupted by Agent Chen's arrival at the ranger station. Her expression was grim as she addressed the assembled group. "We've identified Viktor Kozlov through international databases. He's part of a trafficking network that operates across multiple countries, specializing in endangered species. We've been tracking him for 3 years. "Have you found him?" Michael asked. "Not yet, but we've learned something disturbing about his methods. Kozlov doesn't just steal animals, he eliminates witnesses. Permanently." Chen's eyes met Michael's. "You're lucky to be alive, and you might still be in danger." The implications settled over the room like a cold fog. Michael realized that his encounter with the trafficking ring was far from over. Viktor Kozlov was still out there, along with his associates, and they had every reason to want Michael silenced permanently. "We can offer you protection," Agent Chen continued. "Witness relocation, if necessary. But given the remote nature of this area and the resources at Kozlov's disposal, the safest option might be for you to leave Yellowstone entirely." Michael considered this for a long moment, thinking about the blue-eyed wolf that had saved his life. What about the wolf? If Kozlov comes back, that animal could be in danger too. Dr. Martinez shook her head. "We can't provide protection for wildlife. Our resources are already stretched thin, trying to monitor the park's established wolf packs." "Then I'm staying," Michael said firmly. "That wolf saved my life when it had every reason to avoid human contact. I won't abandon it now." Agent Chen frowned. "Mr. Ross, you're talking about risking your life for an animal that doesn't even know you're trying to protect it." "That animal knows exactly who I am," Michael replied, "and somehow it understood that I needed help when no one else did." "I'm not leaving." As autumn deepened into early winter, Michael established a semi-permanent camp in the backcountry, using his photography assignment as cover for what had become a personal mission. He documented not just the blue-eyed wolf's behavior, but also watched for signs of Kozlov's return. The memory of those cold gray eyes haunted his dreams, and he knew with certainty that the trafficking operation would eventually come back to Yellowstone. The wolf seemed to sense Michael's presence in the area, occasionally appearing at the edges of clearings where the photographer worked. These encounters became a strange form of communication. The animal would show itself briefly, as if confirming that both were still alive and alert, before disappearing again into the vast wilderness. Dr. Martinez visited Michael's camp regularly, ostensibly to collect his behavioral observations, but really to ensure he wasn't losing his grip on reality. "You realize what you're doing is unprecedented," she told him during one of these visits. "No one has ever documented sustained interaction between a wild wolf and a human outside of captivity." "Maybe no one has ever been saved by a wolf before," Michael replied, adjusting his telephoto lens as movement caught his attention across the valley. "Or maybe," Martinez said quietly, "no one has ever needed saving quite like you did." Her words carried weight that went beyond the immediate situation. Michael knew she was referring not just to his physical rescue from the rope, but to something deeper. The way the wolf encounter had given him purpose again after years of drifting through grief and survivor's guilt. As the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Michael's vigil took on increased urgency. Winter would drive wildlife to lower elevations, concentrating animals in areas where they would be more vulnerable to trafficking operations. If Viktor Kozlov was planning to return, it would likely be soon. The wolf, too, seemed to sense that something was changing. Its appearances became more frequent, and Michael began to notice that it was often watching him from positions that provided clear sight lines to the surrounding area. It was as if the animal had appointed itself as a guardian, keeping watch for threats that might approach the human who had become an unexpected fixture in its territory. Neither of them understood that the greatest threat was already moving through the darkness toward them, guided by sophisticated equipment and driven by a fury that would not be satisfied until both the wolf and the man who had witnessed too much were eliminated permanently. The first sign of trouble came on a bitter November morning when Michael discovered boot prints in the fresh snow around his campsite. The tracks were too large to belong to any park ranger he knew, and they circled his tent in a pattern that suggested surveillance rather than casual investigation. Someone had been watching him sleep, close enough to count his breaths in the frigid mountain air. Michael immediately radioed the ranger station, but Agent Chen's response was grimly unsurprising. "Kozlov's back in the country," she confirmed over the crackling radio. "Homeland Security flagged him entering through Seattle 3 days ago using a Canadian passport. We think he's coming for you." The realization that he was being hunted sent ice through Michael's veins that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. He had spent weeks preparing for this possibility, but the reality of being stalked by professional killers in one of America's most remote wilderness areas was more terrifying than any combat situation he had faced in Afghanistan. "Pack up and get to the ranger station immediately," Chen ordered. "We're initiating protective protocols." But as Michael began breaking down his camp, movement in the nearby tree line caught his attention. The blue-eyed wolf emerged from the shadows, its scarred face tense with alertness. The animal's body language communicated danger as clearly as any spoken warning, ears pinned back, hackles raised, nose testing the wind for threatening scents. The wolf approached Michael's position with deliberate caution, those intelligent blue eyes scanning the surrounding forest. When it reached the edge of camp, it began following the same boot prints that Michael had discovered, its behavior becoming increasingly agitated as it traced the intruder's path. Michael understood with crystalline clarity that the wolf was trying to warn him. Somehow this wild predator had detected the human threat that endangered them both. The trafficking ring had returned and they were closing in. "I know," Michael whispered to the wolf. "I can feel them out there too." As if responding to his words, the wolf lifted its scarred muzzle and released a sound Michael had never heard before, not a howl, but something closer to a whimper. It was the vocalization of an animal that had lost everything once and recognized the approach of similar devastation. The attack came at sunset. Michael was securing his gear when the first tranquilizer dart shattered against the tree beside his head. The distinctive pneumatic hiss of the dart gun was followed immediately by Viktor Kozlov's voice. calling out in accented English from somewhere in the darkening forest, "American photographer, you have caused me considerable expense and inconvenience. Now you will pay for your interference." Michael dove behind a fallen log as more darts whistled through the air around him. His military training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify escape routes, neutralize the threat. But he was outnumbered and outgunned by professionals who knew these woods as well as he did. The wolf materialized beside him as if summoned by the danger. Its presence was both comforting and terrifying. Michael knew that Kozlov's men would kill the animal without hesitation if they had the chance. The trafficking ring dealt in dead wolves as readily as live ones, selling pelts and body parts to buyers who cared nothing for conservation laws. "3 of them," Michael whispered to his unlikely ally, though he knew the wolf couldn't understand his words. "They're trying to surround us." The wolf's response was to bare its fangs in a silent snarl. Those blue eyes held no fear, only the determined fury of a predator prepared to defend its territory. Michael realized that to this animal he had become part of that territory, something worth protecting. Viktor Kozlov emerged from the tree line with his characteristic cold confidence, flanked by the same 2 men who had tied Michael to the tree weeks earlier. The heavy-set accomplice carried a high-powered rifle while the nervous one held the tranquilizer gun. Their formation was professional, designed to eliminate any chance of escape. "You have something that belongs to me," Kozlov announced, his gray eyes fixed on Michael's hiding place. "Photographs that have disrupted a very profitable operation. I am here to collect them, along with interest for my inconvenience." Michael knew that surrendering the evidence would accomplish nothing. Kozlov had already demonstrated his willingness to kill witnesses, and the trafficking ring's reputation was built on eliminating anyone who threatened their operations. The only question was whether Michael would die quickly or slowly. "The FBI already has copies of everything," Michael called out, hoping to buy time. "Killing me won't protect you now." Kozlov's laugh was devoid of humor. "Perhaps. But it will provide satisfaction, and sometimes that is payment enough." The heavy-set man raised his rifle, and Michael prepared to make his final stand. But the blue-eyed wolf had other plans. The animal burst from cover with the explosive power of a natural predator, moving faster than Michael would have believed possible. It didn't attack randomly. Instead, it targeted the man with the tranquilizer gun, understanding instinctively that the dart weapon posed the greatest threat to its survival. The nervous accomplice screamed as 120 pounds of enraged wolf slammed into his chest, driving him backward into a pine tree with bone-crushing force. The tranquilizer gun flew from his hands and disappeared into the underbrush as he fought desperately to protect his throat from snapping jaws. Chaos erupted in the clearing. The heavy-set gunman swung his rifle toward the wolf, but Michael tackled him before he could fire, both men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Years of combat training fought against professional ruthlessness as they struggled for control of the weapon. Viktor Kozlov drew a pistol from his jacket, his cold composure finally cracking as his carefully planned operation disintegrated into mayhem. His eyes darted between Michael wrestling with his associate and the wolf systematically dismantling his other accomplice's ability to fight back. "Enough!" Kozlov screamed, pointing his weapon at the wolf. "I will kill this animal, then finish what I started with you." The threat to his protector galvanized Michael into action. He managed to wrench the rifle away from the heavy-set man and rolled clear, bringing the weapon to bear on Kozlov just as the trafficking leader fired his pistol. The gunshot echoed through the forest like thunder, followed immediately by a sound that would haunt Michael's nightmares for years to come, the wolf's agonized yelp as the bullet found its mark. The blue-eyed wolf collapsed in the snow, bright arterial blood spreading from a wound in its chest. Its eyes found Michael's across the clearing, and in that gaze he saw not accusation or fear, but something that looked remarkably like forgiveness. "No!" Michael's cry was torn from the deepest part of his soul as he watched the animal that had saved his life bleeding out in the Wyoming snow. Rage flooded through him with volcanic intensity, washing away years of careful self-control and military discipline. He squeezed the trigger of the captured rifle, sending Viktor Kozlov diving for cover behind the nearest tree. The other two accomplices, bloodied but alive, scrambled away from the wolf and began retreating toward whatever vehicles had brought them to this remote location. But Michael's attention was focused entirely on the wounded wolf. He dropped the rifle and rushed to the animal's side, pressing his hands against the bleeding wound in a desperate attempt to stem the flow of blood. The wolf's breathing was labored, its blue eyes beginning to glaze with approaching death. "Stay with me," Michael whispered, applying pressure to the wound with techniques learned during his Army medic training. "You saved my life twice. Let me save yours." The wolf's eyes flickered with what might have been understanding. Its tongue licked weakly at Michael's hand, a gesture of trust that brought tears to the photographer's eyes. Despite everything, the species barrier, the wildness that should have made such connection impossible, they had found something precious in each other. Viktor Kozlov's voice cut through Michael's desperate efforts to save his protector. "You cannot save it, American, just as you could not save your wife and daughter." The words hit Michael like physical blows. Kozlov had researched his target thoroughly, learning about the accident that had destroyed Michael's family 3 years earlier. The trafficking leader was using that knowledge as a weapon, trying to break his enemy's will to fight. "At least they died quickly," Kozlov continued with calculated cruelty. "This wolf will suffer longer, bleeding out slowly while you watch helplessly. Just like you watched helplessly while they died in that hospital." Michael's hands never stopped working on the wolf's wound, but inside, something fundamental shifted. The guilt and self-recrimination that had paralyzed him for years crystallized into pure, focused determination. He would not lose another innocent life to human cruelty, not today, not ever again. The wolf's breathing grew more labored as Michael pressed his jacket against the bullet wound, watching helplessly as bright arterial blood soaked through the fabric. His military medical training told him everything he didn't want to accept. The bullet had likely punctured a lung, and without immediate surgical intervention, the animal would die within minutes. Viktor Kozlov's taunting voice echoed through the trees as he used the confusion to reposition himself for a better shot. "You see how useless your efforts are, American? Just like when your family lay dying in that hospital, all your medical training, all your desperate prayers, and still you could not save them." Michael's hands trembled as memories flooded back. Sarah's broken body on the operating table, Emma's small hand growing cold in his as the machines stopped beeping. The same crushing helplessness he had felt 3 years ago now overwhelmed him as he watched another innocent life slip away despite his best efforts. "Please don't leave me," Michael whispered to the wolf, his voice breaking with emotion. "You're the only good thing that's happened to me since they died. You're the only reason I still believe there's something worth fighting for in this world." The wolf's blue eyes, already dimming with approaching death, seemed to focus on Michael's face with tremendous effort. Its tongue licked weakly at his blood-covered hands, a gesture of trust and affection that shattered what remained of Michael's composure. Tears froze on his cheeks in the bitter mountain air as he realized he was about to lose the creature that had saved not just his life, but his soul. A rifle shot cracked through the clearing, and bark exploded from the tree beside Michael's head. Kozlov had found a new firing position and was methodically eliminating any cover that might protect his target. The other two accomplices, though bloodied from their encounter with the wolf, had regrouped and were advancing with professional coordination. "Time to finish this charade," Kozlov called out. "First, I kill your wolf friend. Then I take my time with you, photographer. I want you to suffer as much as you have cost me." Michael looked down at the dying wolf in his arms, then at the rifle he had dropped earlier, now lying 10 feet away in open ground. Reaching it would mean abandoning the wounded animal and exposing himself to certain death. But staying meant watching his protector die while Kozlov's men closed in for the kill. The wolf seemed to understand the impossible choice. With tremendous effort, it raised its scarred head and fixed those intelligent blue eyes on Michael's face. In that gaze, Michael saw not just an animal's consciousness, but something deeper, a spirit that had suffered tremendous loss yet still chose to protect others. The wolf had lost its mate and pups to human cruelty, yet when it found Michael tied to that tree, it had chosen rescue over revenge. The dying animal's message was clear. Live. Fight. Don't let their sacrifice be meaningless. "I understand," Michael whispered, gently stroking the wolf's scarred muzzle. "Thank you for everything you've given me. Thank you for showing me what it means to be brave." He kissed the wolf's forehead, feeling the animal's labored breathing against his chest, then carefully lowered it to the snow. The wolf's eyes never left his face as Michael rose to his feet, no longer the broken man who had stumbled into Yellowstone 6 months earlier, but someone transformed by witnessing pure, selfless courage. Michael sprinted toward the rifle as gunfire erupted around him. A bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him sideways, but his momentum carried him to the weapon. He rolled behind a fallen log as more shots splintered the wood above his head, then came up firing with the methodical precision of his military training. The heavy-set accomplice screamed and went down, clutching his shattered kneecap. The nervous man dove for cover, his earlier encounter with the wolf having destroyed his appetite for direct confrontation, but Viktor Kozlov stood his ground, his cold gray eyes burning with fanatic determination as he advanced through the gunfire. "You cannot escape what you have done to me," Kozlov shouted, his professional composure finally cracking completely. "My operation, my profits, my reputation, all destroyed by one interfering American with a camera." Michael's return shot caught Kozlov in the shoulder, spinning the trafficking leader around and sending his pistol flying into the snow. But instead of retreating, Kozlov pulled a tactical knife from his boot and continued his advance, blood streaming down his arm. "I will carve the answers from your flesh," Kozlov snarled, his accent thickening with rage. "You will tell me where you have hidden the evidence, then you will beg for death like your wolf friend." The mention of the dying wolf ignited something primal in Michael's chest. He dropped the empty rifle and drew the combat knife from his own boot, the blade Sarah had given him before his deployment to Afghanistan. They circled each other in the blood-stained snow, two men who had lost everything they cared about, now fighting for the right to determine what their losses would mean. Kozlov struck first, his blade flashing toward Michael's throat with professional skill. But Michael had learned knife fighting from Special Forces instructors who understood that survival often came down to who wanted to live more. He deflected the strike and countered with a thrust that opened a long gash across Kozlov's ribs. "This is for the wolf families you've destroyed," Michael growled, pressing his attack. They fought with desperate fury among the pine trees, their blades drawing blood with each exchange. Kozlov was skilled and ruthless, but Michael fought with the strength of someone who had finally found something worth dying for. When Kozlov stumbled over a hidden root, Michael seized the opening and drove his blade deep into the trafficking leader's chest. Viktor Kozlov collapsed to his knees, staring down at the knife protruding from his heart with something approaching surprise. You were supposed to die helpless," he whispered, blood frothing from his lips. "Like your family, like your wolf." "My family died in an accident," Michael said quietly, kneeling beside his dying enemy. The wolf died protecting someone who needed protection. You're dying because you chose to profit from cruelty. There's a difference. Kozlov's gray eyes went vacant as death claimed him, and Michael turned away from the corpse to check on his wounded protector. But when he reached the spot where he had left the wolf, he found only a pool of blood in the snow and drag marks leading into the forest. The other two accomplices had vanished as well, apparently using the knife fight as cover for their escape. Michael followed the blood trail for several hundred yards before losing it in rocky terrain where tracks were impossible to read. Somewhere in the vast wilderness, the blue-eyed wolf that had saved his life was either dead or dying alone, just as Michael's family had died while he was absent and helpless. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He had finally found the courage to fight, finally discovered something worth protecting, only to lose it in the same moment of victory. The wolf's sacrifice had saved his life, but the price was almost too much to bear. As sirens wailed in the distance, Agent Chen's response team finally arriving, Michael knelt in the bloody snow and wept for all the innocent lives that human greed had destroyed. The investigation that followed Viktor Kozlov's death revealed the true scope of the trafficking operation that had nearly cost Michael his life. FBI agents found evidence of a network spanning 3 countries, with connections to illegal wildlife markets in Asia and Europe. Kozlov's death had effectively decapitated the organization, but the surviving accomplices had vanished into the wilderness, taking with them any hope Michael had of learning the wolf's fate. Dr. Jennifer Martinez arrived at the crime scene as forensic teams processed the evidence. Her face was grim as she examined the blood trail that disappeared into the rocky terrain beyond the clearing. "There's too much blood loss," she told Agent Chen quietly, not wanting Michael to overhear. Even if the wolf survived the initial wound, it wouldn't have gone far in this condition. But Martinez's assessment proved premature. 3 days after the shooting, she received an urgent call from a park maintenance crew working on the northern access road. They had discovered something extraordinary near an abandoned ranger cabin that hadn't been used in decades. Michael insisted on accompanying Martinez to the location, despite Agent Chen's concerns about his emotional state. The photographer had barely spoken since the shooting, consumed by guilt over his inability to save the creature that had rescued him twice. His hands shook as he loaded film into his camera, the mechanical motions providing the only stability in a world that seemed determined to punish those who dared to care. The abandoned cabin sat in a grove of ancient pines, its roof partially collapsed and walls weathered silver by decades of mountain storms. But it was what they found inside that stopped both scientists in their tracks. The blue-eyed wolf lay on a makeshift bed of pine boughs in the cabin's main room, its chest rising and falling with shallow but steady breaths. Someone had cleaned and bandaged the bullet wound with strips of clean cloth, and a bowl of fresh water sat within reach of the animal's muzzle. Most remarkably, the wolf was not alone. "Dear God," Martinez whispered as her flashlight revealed the cabin's other occupants. An elderly Native American man sat cross-legged beside the wolf, his weathered hands gently stroking the animal's scarred fur. He looked up as the visitors entered, his dark eyes holding neither surprise nor concern at their arrival. Behind him, partially hidden in the cabin's shadows, stood a woman who appeared to be his granddaughter. "You must be Michael," the old man said in accented but clear English. "The wolf has been asking for you." Michael's camera slipped from nerveless fingers as he stared at the impossible scene. How did you find him?" "We did not find him," the old man replied calmly. "He found us, dragged himself nearly 2 miles to our camp, bleeding and close to death, but determined to survive for something important." The woman stepped forward, her expression mixing skepticism with grudging respect. "My grandfather is Thomas Crow Feather. I'm Dr. Sarah Crow Feather, veterinarian from the reservation clinic. Against my better medical judgment, I've been treating your friend here for 3 days." Martinez found her voice first. "That's impossible. A wild wolf wouldn't seek out human medical care. Their instinct is to hide when wounded, not approach potential threats." Thomas Crow Feather's laugh was soft but knowing. "This wolf is not bound by your scientific expectations, Dr. Martinez. He has chosen to trust humans, despite everything your species has done to harm him. That choice has kept him alive when instinct would have led to death." Michael approached the wounded wolf slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The animal's blue eyes tracked his movement, and when he knelt beside the makeshift bed, a weak but unmistakable sound emerged from the wolf's throat. Not a growl or whimper, but something closer to a greeting. "Hello, friend," Michael whispered, gently touching the wolf's uninjured shoulder. "I thought I'd lost you forever." The wolf's tail thumped weakly against the pine boughs, and its tongue licked at Michael's hand with the same trust it had shown during their first encounter weeks ago. But the effort exhausted the animal, and its eyes fluttered closed as it settled back into healing sleep. Dr. Sarah Crowfeather pulled Michael aside to explain the wolf's condition. The bullet missed the heart by millimeters, but it damaged lung tissue and caused significant blood loss. "I've removed the bullet and cleaned the wound, but infection is still a major risk. Recovery will take weeks, possibly months." "Can I help?" Michael asked. "I have medical training, and he seems to respond to me." "That's what I was hoping you'd say," she replied. "Wild animals rarely survive this kind of trauma in captivity. But here, in familiar territory with someone he trusts, he might have a chance." Thomas Crow Feather overheard the conversation and nodded approvingly. "The wolf chose you as much as you chose him. In our traditions, such bonds create responsibilities that transcend species boundaries." Over the following days, Michael established a routine that centered entirely around the wolf's recovery. He moved his camp to the area near the abandoned cabin, spending hours each day sitting beside the wounded animal, reading aloud from books or simply talking about his life, his losses, and his slowly emerging hopes for the future. Dr. Martinez documented these interactions with growing amazement. "The behavioral patterns I'm observing defy every established protocol," she confided to Agent Chen during one of her visits. "That wolf responds to Michael's voice differently than to any other human presence. Its vital signs actually improve when he's nearby." The healing process was slow and punctuated by dangerous setbacks. On the 4th day, the wolf developed a fever that nearly proved fatal. Michael sat with him through the night, applying cool compresses and whispering encouragement as the animal fought for its life. When morning came, the fever had broken, and those distinctive blue eyes were alert and focused once again. "You're too stubborn to die," Michael told his patient with tears of relief streaming down his face. "Just like me." Thomas Crow Feather observed these developments with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen such connections before. "In the old stories," he told Michael during one of their evening conversations, "there are accounts of animals and humans who become spirit-bonded, not domestication, but something deeper, a recognition of shared purpose." "What kind of purpose?" Michael asked. "Usually healing," the old man replied. "Both the human and the animal have suffered trauma that normal recovery cannot address. They find in each other what they cannot find elsewhere. Proof that trust is still possible in a world that has given them every reason to abandon hope." Dr. Sarah Crow Feather remained skeptical of her grandfather's spiritual interpretations, but she couldn't deny the clinical evidence. "The wolf's recovery rate is unprecedented," she admitted to Michael. "Physiologically, there's no medical explanation for why he's healing so quickly or why he's maintained such a calm temperament throughout treatment." As the wolf's strength returned, so did Michael's sense of purpose. The guilt and self-recrimination that had paralyzed him for years began to lift, replaced by something he hadn't felt since Sarah and Emma's death, the conviction that his life had meaning beyond mere survival. "I failed my family because I wasn't there when they needed me," he told the recovering Wolf during one of their daily sessions. "But I was here when you needed me, and somehow you were here when I needed you. Maybe that's how healing really works, not by erasing the past, but by creating new connections that prove love is still possible." The wolf's response was to rest its scarred head against Michael's leg, a gesture of absolute trust that would have been impossible to imagine just weeks earlier. In that moment, both man and animal seemed to understand that they had found something precious in each other, not a replacement for what they had lost, but evidence that their capacity for love had survived their trauma. Agent Chen arrived at the cabin on a cold December morning with news that would change everything. "We found Kozlov's other accomplices," she announced. "Caught them trying to cross into Canada with a truck full of stolen wildlife. They're talking, providing information about trafficking routes throughout the region." "What does that mean for us?" Michael asked, instinctively including the wolf in his pronoun choice. "It means the immediate threat is over," Chen replied. "You're free to return to your normal life whenever you're ready." Michael looked down at the wolf, whose recovery had progressed to the point where it could walk short distances around the cabin. Those blue eyes met his with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its complexity. "I'm not sure what normal means anymore," Michael said quietly. "But I think that might be a good thing." The revelation he was about to receive would challenge everything he thought he knew about the wolf's past and force him to confront questions about justice, redemption, and the possibility that some bonds transcend even the barrier between life and death. The final revelation came not from Agent Chen's investigation, but from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Hendricks arrived at the abandoned cabin on a gray February morning, his expensive SUV looking incongruous among the snow-laden pines. Michael recognized him immediately from published research papers, one of the country's leading wolf biologists, renowned for his aggressive advocacy of predator control policies. "Mr. Ross," Hendricks said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, "I've come to discuss your remarkable wolf." Dr. Martinez emerged from the cabin, her expression wary. She had been documenting the wolf's recovery for her own research, but Hendricks represented a different school of thought entirely, one that viewed wolves as threats to be managed rather than individuals to be understood. "Dr. Hendricks," Martinez said coolly, "I wasn't expecting you here. The scientific community is buzzing about your documentation of human-wolf bonding," Hendricks replied. "Such behavior patterns could revolutionize our understanding of predator psychology. I'd like to examine the animal personally." Michael stepped protectively closer to the cabin entrance. Over the past 2 months, he had developed an almost paternal instinct regarding the wolf's welfare. "He's still recovering from serious injuries. I don't think additional stress would be helpful." Hendricks smiled with the condescension of someone addressing an amateur. "Mr. Ross, I've been studying wolves for 25 years. I know how to handle them safely." His eyes fixed on the cabin doorway where the wolf had appeared, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices. "Remarkable. Those blue eyes are indeed unique." The wolf's reaction to Hendricks was immediate and visceral. The animal's hackles rose, its lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and it pressed itself against the cabin wall in a defensive posture Michael had never seen before. The wolf trembled with barely contained aggression, as if recognizing something threatening in the visiting scientist. "Interesting," Hendricks murmured, seemingly unaware of the animal's hostility. "Classic fear response, but the intensity suggests previous trauma associated with human contact." Thomas Crow Feather, who had been sitting quietly on the cabin's front step, stood with the fluid grace of someone half his age. "That wolf knows you," he said simply, "or knows your kind." "Impossible," Hendricks scoffed. "I've never encountered this particular animal before." But the old man's dark eyes held certainty that transcended academic credentials. 27 years ago, there was a pack in the Lamar Valley, alpha pair with 4 nearly grown pups. They were killed illegally during the hunting moratorium. Hendricks's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. There were many illegal killings during that period. Wolves were not popular with local ranchers. The hunter was named James Hendricks, Thomas continued relentlessly. He used illegal snares and poisoned bait, killed the alpha female first, then the pups one by one, saved the alpha male for last, wanted to see him suffer the loss of his family. The color drained from Dr. Hendricks' face. "My father died during that hunting expedition. Wolf attack. I was 12 years old." "Your father died because the alpha male broke free from a snare and fought back," Thomas corrected. "Self-defense, not attack. But you were too young to understand the difference." Michael looked between the two men, pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place. "You think this wolf—" "This wolf is that alpha male's son," Thomas said with quiet conviction. "Born after his family was slaughtered, raised by dispersed pack members who found him starving. The blue eyes come from his mother's bloodline, a genetic marker that appears once in 10,000 births." Dr. Hendricks stared at the trembling wolf with dawning recognition. "If what you're saying is true, then this animal represents everything I've spent my career trying to prove. Wolves are dangerous. They hold grudges. They pose ongoing threats to human safety." "Look at him," Michael said firmly. "Really look at him. This wolf saved my life twice, despite every reason to fear and hate humans. His family was destroyed by your father's cruelty, yet he chose trust over revenge. What does that tell you about the true nature of wolves?" The wolf, as if understanding the conversation's significance, took a tentative step forward, its blue eyes fixed on Dr. Hendricks with an intensity that seemed to strip away years of scientific detachment and academic theory. Hendricks backed away instinctively. "It's staring at me like it knows." "He does know," Thomas said softly. "Animals remember trauma across generations, but watch what he chooses to do with that memory." The wolf continued its slow approach, each step deliberate and controlled. Michael tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but something in the animal's body language suggested intention rather than aggression. When the wolf reached Dr. Hendricks, it stopped just beyond arm's reach and sat down. The defensive posture melted away, replaced by something that looked remarkably like patient attention. The wolf's scarred head tilted slightly, as if studying the man whose father had destroyed its family. "My God," Dr. Martinez whispered. "He's choosing not to react with aggression. Even with all that generational trauma, he's demonstrating behavioral restraint." Hendricks knelt slowly, his academic mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. 25 years of research," he said quietly. 25 years of proving that wolves are dangerous predators who threaten human communities. And this animal is showing me mercy I'm not sure I deserve." The wolf extended its scarred muzzle and briefly touched Hendricks's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only seconds, but its impact was profound. When the animal withdrew, both man and wolf seemed changed by the interaction. "I need to reconsider everything," Hendricks said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My entire career has been built on the assumption that my father's death proved wolves are inherently dangerous. But if this wolf can forgive—" "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting," Michael said. "He remembers what happened to his family, but he's chosen to break the cycle of violence rather than perpetuate it." Dr. Martinez was already making notes, recognizing the historic significance of what she had witnessed. This challenges fundamental assumptions about predator behavior and memory inheritance. The implications for wildlife management policy could be revolutionary. As winter began its slow retreat from the Yellowstone high country, Michael faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. The wolf had recovered sufficiently to return to the wilderness, but their bond had grown beyond anything either species was supposed to be capable of experiencing. "He could come with me," Michael told Thomas Crowfeather during one of their evening conversations. "I could apply for special permits, establish a sanctuary where he'd be safe from future trafficking operations." The old man shook his head gently. "That wolf chose to save you because you needed saving, but keeping him captive, even in comfort, would be another kind of killing. Wild things must remain wild to remain themselves." Michael knew Thomas was right, but the thought of separation felt like losing his family all over again. The wolf had given him back his ability to love, to trust, to believe in the possibility of connection despite loss. The answer, when it came, surprised everyone. On the first warm day of spring, as Michael prepared to return to civilization and the wolf prepared to reclaim his territory, they discovered they weren't the only ones who had been changed by their unlikely partnership. Emerging from the forest came a small pack of wolves, 3 adults and 2 juveniles, drawn by the alpha male's presence and accepting his leadership despite his association with humans. The blue-eyed wolf had found a new family, one that included both his own species and the human who had proven that love could transcend even the deepest wounds. The spring morning, when Michael finally said goodbye to his blue-eyed protector, dawned clear and bright over the Yellowstone wilderness. 3 months had passed since the shooting, and the wolf's recovery had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. The bullet wound had healed completely, leaving only a small scar to join the others that marked his survival story. Michael stood at the edge of the meadow where he had first been rescued, watching as the wolf prepared to rejoin the wild with his newly formed pack. The 3 adults and 2 juveniles that had emerged from the forest had accepted the scarred alpha's leadership naturally, drawn by his calm intelligence and protective instincts. Dr. Martinez finished her final behavioral observations, her research notes documenting what would become a landmark study in human-animal bonding. "What you two have shared will change how we understand the capacity for cross-species connection," she told Michael. "This documentation could revolutionize wildlife conservation policies nationwide." Thomas Crowfeather had insisted on being present for this farewell ceremony. "In our traditions," he explained to the assembled group, "when a spirit bond has served its purpose, it doesn't end, it transforms into something that guides both beings forward." Agent Chen had arrived with official papers declaring the trafficking case permanently closed. Viktor Kozlov's network had been dismantled completely, with several dozen arrests made across 3 countries. "Your wolf's sacrifice helped save hundreds of animals," she told Michael. "The evidence you gathered became the foundation for the largest wildlife crime prosecution in federal history." But Michael's attention was focused entirely on the blue-eyed wolf, who stood perfectly still at the forest edge, watching the human who had become his unlikely family. The animal's posture radiated health and confidence, but those distinctive eyes held something that transcended mere physical recovery. "He's waiting for permission," Michael realized. "He won't leave until he knows I understand." Michael walked slowly across the meadow, stopping just within touching distance of the wolf. For a long moment they studied each other's faces, the man who had lost everything and found meaning again, and the wild creature who had chosen trust over vengeance despite every reason to do otherwise. "Thank you," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for saving my life, for showing me how to love again, for teaching me that healing is possible, even after the worst loss." He gently touched the wolf's scarred muzzle. "Now go be wild and free. That's who you're meant to be." The wolf's response was to press his forehead briefly against Michael's chest, directly over his heart. The gesture lasted only seconds, but its meaning was unmistakable, a final acknowledgment of the bond they had shared and a blessing for the separate paths they would now walk. With fluid grace, the wolf turned and trotted toward his waiting pack. The other wolves fell into formation around him, recognizing his natural authority. As the group disappeared into the forest, the blue-eyed alpha looked back once, meeting Michael's gaze across the distance. Michael remained in the meadow long after the pack had vanished, processing the magnitude of what had transpired. He had come to Yellowstone as a broken man seeking meaning and photographing wildlife. He was leaving as someone who had experienced firsthand that love could transcend species, that trust could survive trauma, and that healing was possible for any heart willing to remain open. Dr. Martinez approached quietly. "What will you do now?" "I'm going to establish a foundation," Michael replied without hesitation. "Wildlife protection, anti-trafficking enforcement, research into human-animal bonding. I've got book deals lined up, speaking engagements, documentary contracts. Sarah and Emma would want their deaths to mean something positive." "And personally?" Martinez pressed gently. "Are you ready to rejoin the human community?" Michael smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression she had seen from him in months. "I think I already have. That wolf taught me that family isn't just about blood relationships or even the same species. It's about choosing to care for others despite the risk of loss." 6 months later, Michael stood before a packed auditorium in Denver, addressing a conference of wildlife biologists and conservationists. Behind him, a massive photograph showed the blue-eyed wolf in the moment of their first meeting, wild, intelligent, and impossibly compassionate. "Connection requires courage," Michael told his audience. "The courage to trust despite past betrayal, to love despite inevitable loss, to believe in goodness despite evidence of cruelty. A wild wolf taught me that courage, and it changed everything." In the question period that followed, someone asked if he ever returned to Yellowstone to look for his wolf friend. Michael's answer brought tears to many eyes. "Every spring I go back to that meadow. I've never seen him again directly, but I find his tracks in the snow, signs that his pack is thriving. Sometimes the greatest love means letting go completely, trusting that what you've shared will endure in ways beyond physical presence." The foundation Michael established in honor of Sarah, Emma, and his blue-eyed guardian has since protected thousands of acres of wildlife habitat and funded research that continues to challenge our understanding of the emotional lives of wild animals. Most importantly, it serves as living proof that even the deepest wounds can become sources of healing when love is allowed to transcend the boundaries we think separate us from one another. Sometimes life brings us unexpected guardians who arrive precisely when hope seems lost. For those of us who've experienced profound loss, whether through death, divorce, or the simple passage of time, Michael's story reminds us that healing often comes from the most unlikely sources. Like that blue-eyed wolf, we can choose to respond to pain with compassion rather than bitterness, to build bridges instead of walls. Perhaps the most beautiful truth in this story is that love doesn't end when someone leaves our life. It transforms into wisdom that guides us toward new connections. Have you ever experienced an unexpected moment of grace during your darkest hour, when help arrived from someone or something you never would have expected? What wild or wounded part of your own heart might be ready to trust again, to extend compassion despite past hurts?